But my presentation is called The Promised Land of Lot, Deep Structure in the Old Covenant Creation. I hope that title kind of strikes you as odd. One of the neat things about covenant creation is it starts opening up the Bible in ways that I was not expecting before I actually held the view and coming into covenant creation perspectives and seeing the scriptures in quite a different light. So I wanted to give you a demonstration more than anything else today of how covenant creation works. Not so much argumentation, but a demonstration of how it works. Not everyone here attended the conference, so I'll have to give you a quick crash course for those who were curious, those who missed the conference. Basically, we presented covenant creation as an ancient way of thinking of creation. Remember, Jeff talked about the Hammurabi Code, how in the prologue of the Hammurabi Code, we had like a creation story, and yet the Hammurabi Code is all about a law. And we see this in other ancient cultures as well, particularly Mesopotamian culture, where they had this idea of the gods creating them as a people, as a city-state, later with the Greeks as well. So just as covenant eschatology challenges modern views of eschatology, which all hinge on a physical universe view of the end, covenant creation challenges modern views of Genesis creation. If the end is not about the end of the physical universe, then covenant creation argues neither is the beginning. Covenant creation's view of the original creation is primarily legal or covenantal. I used this analogy back in the conference. Do you see all the different states in different colors? Do you see all the lines on that map? Do you see all the borders that outline the United States as a whole, as a perimeter? What kind of a map is that? Is it a true map? Yes, it's a true map, but is that a literal map of the physical land that we call North America? Well, it's a true map of something. It's a legal map, but it's not a map that describes the physical land in the place we call America. This is a map of a world that had a beginning, and we can understand that as 1776, and it actually had a transition period as well, because our country as we know it today did not exist until 1789 with the ratification of the Constitution. And so this is sort of a good analogy that I used during the Covenant Creation Conference. But you will not find any kind of a physical description on that map of the physical land that we call North America. The map is useless as a map of topography, population, geology, or anything that is physical. And so if people want to take this literally and say this is a map that we have to take literally, and they see that Ohio is orange, and they look around, we have a problem, right? Or if you were to drive from state to state, those black lines that are on the map aren't going to show up. I mean, where are those black lines separating all the states? They're not there on the ground. So it is a map of something, but it's not a map that you can take in the common sense of literal. It's a map that also had a beginning and an end, and will have an end one day, I'm sure, but like the idea of a covenant world, has a beginning and an end. And so if you were to try to take this map literally, you'd come to some interesting conclusions. You could say either that the map is false, or correctly you could say that the map wasn't given to tell people about the physical land that we call North America, right? We could come to that conclusion. Or we could just say Ohio is orange. I don't care what I see, or I don't care whatever anybody says, Ohio is orange. And we could stand on the assumptions there about what that map is all about. But I think that's a good analogy because it shows how we can separate a covenant map from the physical world, because we all know that the North American continent was there long before this world that we recognize as America. And it's interesting because no matter where you go on planet Earth, you're still covenantally speaking in this map somewhere as an American citizen. So it's non-physical, but it's legal and covenantal. That's really what covenant creation is all about. It says Genesis creation is using various symbolic elements to chart a covenant world that began at some point in time and came to an end at some point in time. That would be, of course, AD 70. So neither the beginning nor the end is given as a physical description of the physical universe, just like that map. Now, there's a little problem with this map, and I think as you see the difference between this map and what I'm going to put up next, you're going to see where I'm going with this, because what's missing on that map? Canada and Mexico. All right, so this is a little bit better. We now have Canada to the north and Mexico to the south, and we also have a representation of the sea. Okay, so we've got some more things being added to this map. And this is really a good analogy of where I'm going to go with my presentation today. But again, more introductory material. We saw how Genesis 1 sets up two distinct parallel portions or jurisdictions of the Old Covenant creation, the sea and the land. We saw how God created, bara in Hebrew, heavens and earth in Genesis 1, the creatures of the sea in day 5, and man on the land day 6. And that's all that we have as the examples of bara, or create, in Genesis 1. And I argue that those jurisdictions represent the covenant function related to Gentiles and Israel. So the waters, plural, correspond to the nations of the Old Covenant creation in a legal jurisdictional sense. And the land, singular, matches up with Israel. We see this theme going all through the Old Testament. Even in the New Testament, we see it continuing on with the same story. We have it in the temple and tabernacle architecture with the Holy of Holies representing heaven, where God dwells. The inner courts represent earth, where Israel had access to, and the outer courts were sea. So God-fearing Gentiles, as sea, worship the one true God from a distance in the Old Covenant creation. And so we see the story is that the high priest enters into the Holy of Holies, into heaven, according to the pattern, once a year on behalf of the people to make atonement for sin in God's special presence. So the temple and the tabernacle was a physical model of the covenant world introduced in Genesis 1. And of course, we can see how the temple and the tabernacle were made after the pattern. Well, there has to be a pattern before them, and that's really ultimately what Genesis 1 is setting up: heavens, earth, and sea. Now, it should not surprise us then that Genesis 1 presents a special focus, a special emphasis on the land, right? I used this quote earlier. Dr. John Sale Hammer says, thus, from the start, the author betrays his interest in the covenant by concentrating on the land in the account of creation. And preterists say, duh, that's Israel, right? That makes perfect sense. Israel is at the center of the entire Old Testament. If you don't understand that, you're not going to understand eschatology. It's Israel's Messiah. It's Israel's promise. It's Israel's resurrection. God had a unique purpose for His special nation in covenant history. And yet we as preterists sometimes make the mistake of saying that the Old Testament is exclusively about Israel, or we kind of tend to go that direction. But yet we know from Genesis 1 that there is this sea aspect of the Old Covenant creation. There is this sea dimension that sort of, from our modern perspective, looks kind of odd. We don't really know exactly what to do with it. But Genesis 1, the structure of Genesis 1, alerts us to something else beyond the land. And so let me continue with this issue. I could put it a different way. A lot of us preterists come from dispensational backgrounds. Dispensationalism also places a huge emphasis on Israel in covenant history, right? That's a real distinctive mark of dispensationalism. In fact, dispensationalists tend to make the covenant history to be exclusively about Israel. They present the church age and the conversion of the Gentiles as an entirely new concept in the New Testament. They say that God did something new or unknown in the New Testament. Of course, that's not true if you read the prophets, because the prophets are talking about what's going to come in the New Testament. So it's easy to dispense with that kind of a mistaken notion. But we carry baggage into our preterism from our past. And I think that we still have a latent dispensationalism, even within preterist circles to some degree or other. Or dispensationalists tend to view Israel as unconditionally blessed and the Gentiles as unconditionally cursed in the Old Testament. Is that true? I don't think it is. If you read the stories carefully, you don't see that. Or in the modern context, we call this simplistic view Zionism. But it doesn't stop there. We don't just apply Zionism. And what I'm saying, I'm making a connection between the way we look at Old Covenant history. We don't just think of Zionism, or we shouldn't just think of Zionism in a modern context, because there can be a theological Zionism that goes at our perspective of the Old Testament. And I believe that's where the latent dispensationalism comes in. Zionism applied to covenant history says that the Jews were always the good guys and the Gentiles were the bad guys, or the association would be that Israel is the believers and the Gentiles are the unbelievers, right? That's like a theological version of Zionism applied to covenant history. And so one example would be the story of the Babylonian conquest. Dispensationalists usually present that as poor little Israel there, and that evil, wicked king Nebuchadnezzar came in and crushed them. But what do we get from the story? You read Daniel closely, you find out Nebuchadnezzar is a believer, and Israel is wicked. And so Nebuchadnezzar becomes God's servant, and with Daniel at his right hand on the final time, goes in and destroys Judah, destroys the temple. So it's quite different if you look at the details. It doesn't really work out in a simplistic Zionistic kind of sense. So the ultimate problem with dispensationalism, of course, is they have a very warped view of God. And that boils down to a racist view of God, because they have this idea that because someone was born, God has special favor on them that he does not give to anyone else. And that's ultimately a racist form of God. And even some preterists have this idea that, well, that was true back then, but then God gave that up. That was just so old. That was bad. He figured it out. And I don't believe that works either. So, Israel as the believers and Gentiles as the unbelievers in the Old Testament is not an accurate picture of covenant history, whether it is contemporary or ancient history. So Zionism doesn't work from the beginning or the end. Covenant creation offers the solution. Well, the sea is part of God's covenant creation from the very beginning. And covenant history bears the fact out that other nations, Gentile nations, had a relationship to God by faith. Not the same relationship as Israel. Israel's still very unique. So please understand that I'm not trying to present this idea that the Gentiles and Israel had the same relationship to God. I'm not saying that. I'm not trying to downplay Israel's role. I'm trying to add a dimension that is very neglected or overlooked with the sea, this relationship to Gentiles in the Old Testament. The whole story is that God's original covenant creation was made up of both land and sea. And Israel sometimes became puffed up in their special relationship with God and thought that it made them somehow special, different, right? That was a temptation for Israel to do on various occasions. Whenever that happened, the prophets, including Jesus, insulted the Judaistic sensibilities by talking about God's relationship with Gentiles right next to his special relationship with Israel. This happens quite a bit, actually. Stephen does it in Acts as well. Here is one representative example. Are not you Israelites the same to me as Cushites, declares the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt, the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir? And the rhetorical answer is yes, of course, because we'll see that this is rooted in Deuteronomy chapter 2. But we have to purge our Zionistic conceptions from our thinking if we want to see clearly that God ordained the exodus of other nations as well as the exodus of Israel from Egypt. This is part of covenant history. And it's that jurisdictional boundary between land and sea that we see this all work out. Or consider that God ordained worship from the Hebrews and from the Gentiles. That's what the architecture of the temple is really telling us. That court of the Gentiles, that sea court, is still part of the worship of God from a distance. So, consider these representative examples of Gentile believers, how God interacts with Gentiles in the Old Testament. Pharaoh learned of God through Joseph, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. In fact, judgment on Egypt, I believe, at the Exodus came as a result of the failure of Egypt to listen to God's word. What does Moses go, the prophet, go to Pharaoh? He says, let my people go. That was God's word to Egypt. And yet Egypt had an experience, had a knowledge of God through Joseph. And so Egypt is judged based on their past experience. Their knowledge of God is really the background of that judgment and also the other prophecies against Egypt. And we also see this coming back up in the New Testament with Revelation chapter 11. It's a pattern of judgment. Egypt is a pattern of judgment in the first century, and Bill Spears did a great job of showing the pattern between Exodus in the Old Testament and the Exodus theme in the book of Revelation. That's because those are covenant judgments, and that therefore they are similar. Here's an interesting story. Moses married Zipporah, the daughter of a Midianite priest. Wow, you got a priest out there who is a Gentile in the days of Moses. So here's a question. Did Moses violate his own law to come by intermarrying with a Gentile? No, I don't believe he did, because it was a believing Gentile. See? Moses went on to write in the law that the Israelite men could marry believing Gentile women following a ceremonial conversion. And that's all laid out in Deuteronomy chapter 21. People overlook that kind of stuff as well. Balaam was a prophet of God, well known to a Moabite king. In Numbers, we see that story. We'll get more to this story in a moment. The widow at Zarephath in Sidon was a God-fearing Gentile in Elijah's day. Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. A true believer at a time when there were very few believers. There was no faith in Israel at that time. That's why Elijah was sent to that widow. Naaman was from Aram. He received the miraculous healing of God through the prophet Elisha. He was a believer. Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. And both of these examples are mentioned by Jesus as faithful in Luke 4. And of course, remember, Luke's written to a Gentile audience. Gentiles from many nations served as David's mighty men. Zalek the Ammonite, Uriah the Hittite, Ithma the Moabite. Are these pagans? Did David bring in a bunch of pagans to sort of help him run his administration? I don't think so. I think these are believers. Where would they have worshipped in this old covenant creation? They would have worshipped at a distance. When David went to the temple, they would have worshipped at a distance in the outer court, the outer courts of the Gentiles. Hiram, king of Tyre, provided material and skill to help build God's temple in Jerusalem. Does this look like a believer to you? Because the Lord loves his people, he has made you their king. And then later we find that Hiram added, praise be to the Lord who made heaven and earth. That's the Hebrew portion of the creation. He has given King David a wise son, endowed him with intelligence and discernment, who will build a temple for the Lord and a palace for himself. And I think that knowledge from the King Hiram sets the context for the prophecy against Tyre in Ezekiel chapter 28. Ruth was a Moabitess who converted to the worship of Jehovah. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. There's a Gentile in the line of Christ. And then there was Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Does this look like something that a true believer would say? To the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation, from the mouth of a Gentile believer. That knowledge of God sets the context for the covenant judgment that came on Babylon. If you read Daniel chapter 5 as a parallel text to Isaiah 13, it's very clear that what's going on there is a covenant judgment. Bears many, many similarities to the prophecies against Israel as well. How about King Darius? May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and he endures forever. Of course, we find that God later judges Persia as well in Daniel chapter 10. Consider Nineveh, whose people and king believed God and repented. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. And of course, Jonah pouted when they believed God, and God turned his judgment away from Nineveh, the great city. And I think the story of Jonah is instructive, because what it shows is that God cared for Gentiles. There is no Zionism in this book. That's what the story of Jonah is telling us. Jonah is being corrected by God. What does God say in response to Jonah? He says that at the very end, the very conclusion of Jonah, Nineveh has more than 120,000 people. Should I not be concerned about that great city? And of course, Nineveh was later judged. That's what the book of Nahum is all about. It's like these Gentiles are on the outside of everything, but the center of nothing in the Old Testament. And sometimes it's easy to miss that. Jesus brought them up. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon at the judgment than for you. See what Jesus just said? There's Gentile nations involved in the judgment. The queen of the south will rise at the judgment with this generation. Looks like a time statement to me, doesn't it? And condemn it. So here's a Gentile woman that Jesus brings up. Who was he talking to? Jewish men. What an insult. That violated their Judaistic sensibilities, because he brings up this idea that the queen of the south will rise at the judgment and condemn that generation. And I think all of those details set the scene for Revelation 20, where we find that the sea gave up the dead that were in it. The sea is judged along with the land at the end of the Old Covenant creation. And I hammered this at the conference. The Great White Throne Judgment matches the structure, heaven, earth, and sea, that is first introduced to us in Genesis chapter 1. It's that entire creation being ripped apart. And the land and the sea is being judged at the same time. We see this with the parables of Jesus. The same structure of the harvest is placed side by side in Matthew 13. The parable of the wheat and the tares is the harvest of the land. And where does Jesus go next? The parable of the net. When he goes in and he harvests the fish. And he starts separating out the fish, just like the fish of the great sea. We saw the same structure all the way back in the prophecies of Isaiah 26 and 27, where the prophet vacillates between the judgment of the land and judgment of the sea. So I think we're still waking up from dispensationalism, is what I'm saying. As preterists, we still have this latent dispensational concept here that causes us to miss a great deal about the Old Covenant creation. Now, I want to spend the rest of my time talking about the promised land of Lot. It's one specific Gentile story within the wider story of all the nations, the waters, plural, in the Old Testament. But it's a story that caught my attention, and I think it's a story that's just fantastic. Did you know that God actually gave Gentiles a promised land? That seems kind of odd. That's why I named this session this name. Here's what God told Moses when Israel came near to their promised land. Then the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab, nor contend with them in battle. I will not give you any of their land as a possession, because I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession. And when you come near to the people of Ammon, do not harass them or meddle with them, for I will not give you any of the land of the people of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to the descendants of Lot as a possession. And the same passage goes on to say that God helped these nations in their conquest of their promised land. This is the law. Deuteronomy 2. God helped them. They, the Zamzummites, were a people strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites, giants, just like Israel had to deal with. The Lord destroyed them from before the Ammonites, who drove them out and settled in their place. The Lord had done the same for the descendants of Esau, who lived in Seir, when he destroyed the Horites from before them. And as for the Avites, who lived in the villages as far as Gaza, the Caphtorites, coming up out of Caphtor, destroyed them and settled in their place. There's the basis for Amos chapter 9. Funny. That's some pretty wild stuff. Yet there it is in the law, talking about the promised land, the possession of Lot. I have never heard. Has anyone heard any sermon or preaching on the promised land of Lot? Is anybody calling for God's divine right for the descendants of the Lot to have their promised land? But there it is, right there in Deuteronomy chapter 2. Just as plain as day in black and white. And we read right over it. Oh, okay. Ooh, I don't know about that. Of course, this promised land we see with Esau is probably the basis for the judgment that comes on Esau in Isaiah 34. But here's what one commentary had to say about the passage. What a strange insight does this parenthesis of 4 verses give into the early history of Palestine. Translation, we don't have a clue. Right? But this is very important, especially in the light of the theology of the New Testament about the promised land. Right? What does the land represent? God's rest. And here in the law, we're starting to see some implications that are going to come to full fruition in the New Testament. Because if Israel had a promised land, and it was symbolic of the rest of God, what happens if we find that Gentiles had a promised land too? See how the story's working? Like everything else in the law, we need to go back to the stories in the early chapters of Genesis to understand what in the world is going on here. Genesis cannot be divided from Exodus and the rest of the law. From where did Israel in Moses' day receive the promised land? In Moses' day, where did they receive the promised land from? From the story of Abraham, right? The father of Israel. That originates with God's promise to Abraham, the father of the circumcision. And so the story of the Exodus is just a continuation of the story told back in the early chapters of Genesis. And that's exactly where we find the story of Lot. So let's look at the story of Lot, and we're going to see how this... we tend to skip over the fact that Abraham did not leave Haran all by himself. Abraham set out by faith in obedience to God's call, along with another family. Abraham and Lot both left Haran by faith. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And the New Testament calls Lot a righteous man, which sounds really weird if you know much about the story of Lot in the details, because there's some pretty nasty things going on in the story of Lot. But there it is in 2 Peter 2. Lot is called a righteous man not once but twice. And I believe it's for the same reason that Abraham was called a righteous man as well. Lot's faith was credited to him as righteousness, just like Abraham. Do you see a theme here? Now, let's follow the story out. What happened after Abram arrived in Canaan? Genesis 13 tells us the land could not support both Abram and Lot's families while they remained together. Gracious Abraham offered the solution when some infighting broke out between the two families. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. That's the source of Lot's possession. Abraham gave that land to Lot. Abram gave Lot the first pick of the land because he wanted to maintain a good relationship. He loved Lot. Now, do the Pharisees and the Judaizers look like they're revealing the personality of Abraham when we get in the New Testament? Are they acting like their father Abraham? Or are they acting like someone else? See, it's not about the Judaizers calling people back to the old ways. Abraham sets the standard for that. Abraham sets the standard of what it was to live in faith in God and be a peacemaker to those who are around him. Abraham was willing to give sacrificially, and so Lot heads east in the story and pitches his tent near Sodom. Next, the story presents Lot in trouble. King Chedorlaomer, that's a tough word to say, carried Lot off with plunder from Sodom, and then Genesis 14 has Abram arriving with his 318 fighters to rescue Lot, and Abram also saves the plunder that was taken from Sodom, but he does not keep anything that belonged to Sodom. Lot is restored, and later we find that he is established as an elder in Sodom. That's actually what we find in Genesis 19, sitting in the gates. Probably due to Abraham's prestige, Lot becomes a leader in the city of Sodom. Notice what happens in Genesis between the rescue of Lot, chapter 14, and the destruction of Sodom in chapter 19. Here we find the story of God's covenant with Abram, the story of Hagar and Ishmael, the institution of circumcision, and Abraham's intercession for the corrupt city of Sodom, which sets a context for what comes next in chapter 19. The order of that detail is very important, because what it means is Lot left Abraham before circumcision. And so Abraham was circumcised as a corporate body, his whole family and his servants. But when he did that, Lot was living over there on the other side of the promised land, uncircumcised. And so the order is pretty important to pay attention to. And since circumcision divided Jew and Gentile, Lot would not be listed in the history of the Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 11. Interesting that Lot doesn't make that list. Well, it doesn't make that list because it's to Hebrews. And Lot, of course, being an uncircumcised man, he is really a Gentile living in Canaan land, the father of the Moabites and the Ammonites, who we consider as Gentiles. Then we have some other interesting details in the story of Lot that start looking really familiar, vaguely resemble Israel's history. What happens when the angels show up in Sodom? Lot takes them into his house and he serves them something very specific. But he, that's Lot, insisted strongly, so they turned into him and entered his house. Then he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. What do you think of when you think of a meal with unleavened bread? How about one at night, on the eve of God's judgment, when the faithful have to flee in haste? You see what Genesis 19 portrays? It is a proto-Passover involving believing Gentiles, the family of Lot. And you can see all these details that are roughly familiar to some stories that come a little bit later in Exodus. The angel of the Lord comes down into the wicked city where the righteous were tormented. The events transpire at night. The meal includes unleavened bread as a main course. The wicked are struck with blindness, just as Egypt was struck by plagues. Lot is told to leave in haste, and God later destroyed some of those whom he saved, Lot's wife, because of the faithless disobedience. And so there are many details in Genesis 19 that I think match up with a Passover theme. Not all the details, but there are themes here that look vaguely familiar. Lot is saved from Sodom just as Israel is saved from Egypt. And it's interesting that Sodom and Egypt are parallel in the New Testament, like in Revelation. We see that coming up as well, Revelation 11. The parallel between Egypt and Sodom is really highlighted as sort of an analogical. And Jeff and I talked about this sort of nuance with Sodom in the last appendix of Beyond Creation Science. We talked about how, actually, Jim did a great job of painting this on that big scroll painting, the apocalyptic vision on the back cover of the book. We have the temple at the center and Noah's Ark in the foreground, representing a Hebrew context, all based on Luke 17. And in the background, we see the city of Sodom going up in flames. So even in our painting there's this nuance in it. We showed how it works in Luke, written to Gentiles, and why there's differences to Matthew, written to a predominantly Jewish audience. The tragic story of Lot continues after Sodom. He ends up doing to his daughters precisely what he offered them for to the wicked men of Sodom. Yet Lot is still considered righteous man by Peter, by faith. He is still a righteous man. And his two daughters bore two sons, Moab and Ammon. So Lot is the father of two Gentile nations in the land. A double inheritance, right? Just like Joseph. Joseph had two tribes, two inheritances in the land. And so Lot's family had both a Passover of sorts and a promised land. And that's really the background for when Israel comes and arrives in Canaan land from Egypt. Lot's descendants are already there. And I'll suggest that the promised land at this point, imagine Israel coming up out of Egypt, when they get to the land, you have a living incarnation of the creation in physical human being form. Because Israel had the center of the land where Shiloh was placed, right? That's where the sacrifices were received, with the Holy of Holies at the center. And around the promised land, on the other side of the Jordan River, are the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Moabites. They're on the outside, like the sea. Just on the ring on the outside of the promised land. That background makes a lot of sense out about more details in the story that follow. Balaam and Balak follow the context. What concerned Balak, king of the Moabites, in Numbers 22? Well, he says it. Then the children of Israel moved and camped on the plains of Moab on the side of the Jordan across from Jericho. And Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of the Moabites at that time. Then he sent messengers to Balaam, please come at once and curse this people, Israel. For they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out of my land. And the story goes on to say that Balak tried to hire Balaam to curse Israel 3 times. And each time Balaam blessed Israel. And at the end of the episode, Balak claps his hands in frustration. Then Balak's anger was aroused against Balaam, and he struck his hands together. And that's when Balak, the prophet, gave the star prophecy to the descendants of Lot. See, we read over all these details because Old Testament is just about Israel. No, the star prophecy, who was that given to? It was given to the king of Moab, a descendant of Lot. File that detail away. Very few people pay attention to that covenant context of that prophecy. But do you see the problem with Balak's actions? See what's wrong here in the big story? What did Abraham, the father of Israel, do with Lot, the father of the Moabites, when they came into the promised land? Abraham shared, right? And here you have Balak resisting the entrance of Israel into their lawful promised land. What should they have done? What should the Moabites and the Ammonites have done? They should have returned the hospitality that their father Lot received from Israel's father Abraham. And that's the precise reason for the curse on the Moabites and the Ammonites in the law. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the road when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor. Ammon and Moab were cursed because of their failure of hospitality. They selfishly tried to bar the children of Israel from their own lawful promised land. And they did other things too in the history of Israel. During the time of the Judges, they attacked Israel in their own land. Then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Moreover, the people of Ammon crossed over the Jordan to fight them. Crossed over the Jordan to fight. Crossed over the Jordan? Uh-oh. Where are they? They're now on Israel's side of the river, right? We should say, uh-oh, at that point. And we have the response from Jephthah, who sent messengers to the king of the people of Ammon, saying, what do you have against me that you have come to fight against me in my land? And the story then explains how Jephthah delivered repentant Israel from the hands of the Ammonites. And we see later in the story of the time of David, David actually sent his father and mother to Moab. When Saul came after him, it's always nice to have long-lost friends if a wicked king is going to try to kill you, because he'll probably try to kill your family too. And so what does David do? He sends his mother and his father to Moab. Now, if the Gentiles have a Passover in a promised land, we should start seeing some parallels here. Then what do you think comes next? Captivity. Like Israel, Moab and Ammon worshiped false gods even when they knew better from their history as the children of Lot. Lot knew God. And so Gentiles go into captivity along with Judah. The word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, set your face against the Ammonites, because you said, Aha, against my sanctuary when it was profaned, and against the land of Israel when it was desolate, Assyria, and against the house of Judah when they went into captivity, Babylon. Indeed, therefore, I will deliver you as a possession to the men of the east, because you clapped your hands, allusion back to Balak, stamped your feet, and rejoiced in heart with all your disdain for the land of Israel. That's not what Lot did with Abraham. This is covenant apostasy. Indeed, therefore, I will stretch out my hand against you and give you as plunder to the nations. See, the Gentiles have their own captivity in the Old Testament. We see this even better in Jeremiah. Note how the whole creation, not just Israel, goes into captivity under Nebuchadnezzar. This is what the Lord said to me, that's Jeremiah, make a yoke out of straps and crossbars and put it on your neck, then send word to the kings of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Same ones mentioned in Deuteronomy 2. Tyre and Sidon has a past history with David and Solomon. And say, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Tell this to your masters, with my great power and outstretched arm, I made the earth and its people and animals that are on it, and I give it to anyone I please. Note the creation reference there. Animals. And yet, here we have it in the context of nations being given over to Babylon, in narrative form no less. Now I will hand all your countries over to my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. I will make even the wild animals subject to him. And I think in that passage the wild animals are people. They are the nations, just as Israel is the man on the land. Does anyone see covenant creation in that text? Because I sure do. I think it reveals why Jeremiah 4:32 talks about the undoing of all creation in his day. I looked at the earth and it was formless and empty, and at the heavens and their light was gone. The entire covenant creation was under judgment with Babylon, not just Israel, but the sea as well. The reign of Nebuchadnezzar includes the captivity of Judah and many Gentile nations as well. Well, if we have a Passover, a promised land, captivity or exile, then what should we consider next for Moab and Ammon? Well, if we are continuing in this line of thought, we should probably recognize that there were probably a promise of restoration. Jeremiah 48 is a prophecy of Moab, and Jeremiah 49 is a prophecy of Ammon. And that's where we find, woe to you, O Moab, the people of Chemosh are destroyed. Your sons are taken into exile and your daughters into captivity. Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the days to come, declares the Lord. Concerning the Ammonites, O unfaithful daughter. Yeah. You trust in your riches and say, who will attack me? I will bring terror upon you, yet afterward I will restore the fortunes of the Ammonites, declares the Lord. Some lessons here, the setting context for the New Testament, isn't it? If Israel has a promise of restoration, we find Gentiles have a promise of restoration as well. The Ammonites were called God's daughter, just like Israel, and Judah were called God's daughter. Ammon, like Israel, was condemned because she relied on her riches. God judged Gentile nations that had the knowledge of God from their heritage, in this case from the days of Lot, just as he judged Israel, who had a special heritage and relationship with God for a special purpose. Again, there is no Zionism in this book. And so we can see why Paul would say, based on the Old Testament, in Romans 2:11, God does not show favoritism. James says the same thing. So I hope you understand how this concept of covenant creation opens up these new perspectives on these old stories and makes the Bible come alive. And I hope it sets a better context for a very familiar story, which is right at the very beginning of the New Testament. And I was talking to an individual recently who was involved with the Gideons, and he showed me the Gideon Bible, the little New Testament, and they was talking about how they give that out. But guess what? If you're giving out the New Testament, you've missed all the story that comes before the beginning of the New Testament. All right? And so it's sort of like in our culture, you give out little Bibles, you get little influence. I think there's a relationship there. I mentioned to him, honestly, I did not like New Testaments. So anyway, I hope that story gives you this new perspective about what comes on early in the New Testament. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. Who are these people? How did they get to know about worshiping the King of the Jews? I think I know who they are. Remember the star prophecy in Numbers 24? That was given to the children of Lot. And the children of Lot descended into pagan idolatry, and God judged them just like he judges Israel. And they went into captivity to the east, to Babylon, where they heard about Nebuchadnezzar's decree to all the nations about the one true God. And they probably knew Daniel or found out about the 70 weeks prophecy. So they had an idea of the time to expect the Messiah. And then they come and they show up at the appropriate time, at the fulfillment of time. And they come worship the Messiah of Israel. They knew that his arrival would usher in the fulfillment of God's promises to them, along with the resurrection of Israel. In the words of Simeon, watch the covenant creation stuff, the jurisdiction issue. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all people. The whole covenant creation awaited the Messiah of Israel. A light for revelation to the Gentiles, see, and for glory to your people, Israel, land. And covenant creation helps us unlock the whole story about what is going on. Because I want you to meditate on that story. Because you know what that story means? What we have with the Magi from the East is really a family reunion of sorts. We're coming all the way back around, and the descendants of Lot, who left Haran with Abraham, are coming together with the faithful of Israel, and both worshiping the same Messiah. And so Lot's descendants and Abraham's descendants are joined back together, bringing the story back around to the beginning that we saw introduced in the very earliest chapters of Genesis. That's how we start understanding our Bible. In fact, I would go so far to say that covenant creation is the only option that makes sense out of the New Testament. Consider these passages, and they're parallel passages. In Mark, we have the Great Commission, go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. And then in Matthew, we have, this is the gospel, and then we have, with Matthew, we have, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. Place those parallel texts right next to each other. What do you have? You have all creation is all nations. And people say, well, how do you get people out of the creation account? That's what Jesus says. All creation is all the nations. And of course, Paul confirms this as well. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pains together until now. The gospel had to be preached to all creation. That's the story that begins in Genesis chapter 1. Jesus has to redeem the whole creation, not just Israel. You see, those passages in Paul, or those passages with the Great Commission, don't make any sense at all if the creation is the physical universe. In fact, the physical universe concept doesn't even fit. It's not about biology, it's about covenant. God's creation is a covenant world related to human beings and their relationship to God. So when God's people finally get it, finally understand this covenant priority of the Bible from beginning to end, covenant creation and covenant eschatology, I believe we will see an unimaginable renaissance in Christian culture and practice, and really the implications are mind-boggling. I believe the solutions to a lot of these problems that have plagued Christians for thousands of years now can be sort of resolved, transcended, or just, going different directions that make them completely irrelevant. And this is really just dawning on us with applying the principles of covenant eschatology to the entire Bible. What do you think will happen when God's people begin to understand that their relationship to God is their entire world? That's how the faithful Hebrews thought. Their covenant relationship with God was their world. There was nothing else. Nothing that came close to that. And here we are, modern Christians arguing about the age of planet Earth. Do you see how we've missed something along the way? We went to the Creation Museum on first day here, and there was one exhibit that really caught my attention. It had the little, conceptual, perfect Baptist church, white church there, and they had this big wrecking ball swinging, like in the motion swinging toward the church. It was a big thing. It was huge. Big display and everything. And on the plaque on the front of that wrecking ball, they had millions of years. You preterists better think about that, because their concept, what they were presenting with that display, was that time was destroying the church. We've missed it from beginning to end. And so I'm challenging you now to change the focus from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22. And I think that's going to help bring families together in our day, because as we start understanding our faith in terms of covenant, understand our relationship with those people around us in terms of covenant relationship as well. And that's going to start bringing healing to families. It's going to bring healing to the wider body of Christ. And I think it'll bring healing, even cultural renewal from the ground up, one Christian at a time. But it's only if we get our priorities straight when we go to read the Bible. Because otherwise you're going to start abusing the Bible in a way it's never been intended to be used. Only when we tell the whole story with all of its glory. So now it's up to you. Keep studying God's Word. Keep living the covenant gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you.